Hey, Nick.
Hey, okay, I thought it was on me. Great. Hey, Stephen, good morning. How are you?
Yeah, good. Lovely to see you, and thank you so much. Where are you? It looks pretty funky.
I know I'm in I have some meetings at a company, F5 Networks, and I'm in their war room right here, like inside. It feels like I'm in like a defense department, like TV movie or something. But so
It's,
if the world is attacked, I think I'm in a good place.
you're on the bridge of the Starship
Exactly.
Enterprise. I think
That's right.
that's where you are. So look, we've got a pretty good roster of people that have already pitched up. We've got 20 people on. We had about well over 50 people registered. So this is such a hot topic. Um, we'll kick into it, and
Great.
people will catch up and join in as we're going along. I've got a couple. We've spoken quite a few times already, and I've got quite a few questions. A couple of questions, and then we'll open up to the floor. I've got a couple from some people who sent them to me beforehand. Um, so just as a way, as an intro for myself, so I'm Stephen with Notion, and we are big fans of Gainsight, and Nick and Dan Steinman, his GM of EMEA, have been incredibly helpful to us. And we all know just how important success is in the SaaS world. And I'm delighted to have this conversation with you, Nick. And I wanted to kind of start off with maybe kind of setting the scene around, can you see? Yeah.
Yeah,
This
I love it.
Look, this is, I believe, one of the best-selling customer success business books on the planet. You've sold over 50,000 copies of this.
Yeah, I think it's the best selling customer success business book on the planet. Now, I don't know how many customer success business books there are, but it's definitely number one. And 50,000, I think it's a sign of just how much interest there is from companies in really rethinking the way they manage their customers. I've been blown away by how many management teams in large companies have made this required reading. So it's been really, really cool.
And was it a deliberate part of your ambition to really kind of define the category to write this book? And did it achieve what you hoped to achieve? And would you do
Yeah.
anything differently?
Okay, so I'll answer all those. So was it deliberate? I would say if you're an entrepreneur on the phone, you've been in startups, necessity is the mother of invention. So in February of 2013, we raised our Series A venture capital, right? And we were building software for customer success teams. And there weren't that many customer success teams. So you can imagine that if one of the biggest challenges you could have is building software for customers that don't exist, right? And so we knew we had to create this industry. We could market our technology all we wanted, but if there was no people to buy it, then what was the point? But we knew that this need was there. So we said, okay, let's devote really the first 5 years of our company's life, marketing, thought leadership, to not marketing our product, but marketing and developing this industry, which as you know, Stephen, led to conferences and blogs and led to this book. Now, answer your other question, how did this compare to our expectations? I have super high expectations for everything. I'm sure most entrepreneurs do. And it's very rare, just being honest, that like anything is better than I wanted, because we all want to be great, right? This book is one of those rare exceptions. I didn't know anything about writing a book. Frankly, I didn't even know people still read business books anymore, like printed, and it turns out that like it's a big thing. And so when we got this email solicitation from a publisher, Wiley, which is a big book publisher, and we thought it was kind of a scam. Like, should we write a book? Like, why would anyone want to read our book, right? But we decided to do it. And then Dan Steinman, who really did a huge chunk of the work, kind of carried a lot of the water in making it happen. And it's way above our expectations. Like, literally, it's one of the things I talk about is like, we had no idea how big this would be, both in terms of volume, but also just impact, the number of companies that just make this part of the way they learn. So it's been great.
Yeah, look, if 2,000 potential customers are buying the book that you wrote about the profession that you're building every month,
Yeah,
that has a pretty big impact. Look,
that's right.
I just wanted to kind of start with a couple of questions, because one of the things I thought was really interesting last time we spoke, and which was about how you've really kind of embedded this culture of success into your organization. You talk about customer success, of course, but you also talk about employee success. investor success. I mean, I love to hear that too. I just you can share some of that with us.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think everyone, I said this recently at a dinner I went to, you can borrow other people's, what or how, meaning you can listen to an AMA or read a blog or listen to a podcast and learn what other people do. You can also learn how they do it, how they do customer success, what they do for sales. I don't think you can ever borrow anybody else's why. The why has to be your own, right? So why you do what you do. And again, side, I think for many of us, and me definitely, the kind of classic why in business of, hey, it's all about the bottom line, wasn't enough. So I think it's important. That's why we call investor success, right? That's the bottom line. But it's not enough. It wasn't enough to get us motivated to feel this is what we should do with our lives. And so we basically came up with this concept of success for all, and the idea that our business will only be successful if our customers, our employees, their families, our community, and our investors are all successful. And so we need to think about all of those. And obviously, as you said, Stephen, that fits really well with the customer success concept. And in general, I'd say it fits well with what I would think of as a concept I think the world's evolving to, which is not everything is a zero-sum game. You know, there are worlds where multiple stakeholders win, and it's not always a you win, I lose, I win, you lose kind of thing. And so success for all, which is one of our 5 company values, became really, really core to how we think about things.
And that's one other thing I'd like to just to ask you a little bit about, which is about something else I think Gainsight is recognized as a leader in. It is the embracing values. I know this is incredibly important to you, so maybe you can just talk a little bit about that.
Totally. Yeah. So it goes back to the same thing I just said, which is, you know, the why, you know, and so for me, when I think about the why behind Gainsight, you know, I really do think all of us have, you know, unfortunately too little time on the earth and like so many choices. If you're fortunate enough to be in this kind of the world that probably many of us are in, there's, you know, a lot of choices we have. So why do what we do? And I think in our definition of why, there's when you create a company, you're kind of creating an organization of human beings, and there's a way to ability to run those in a way that feels good to you. And so we came up with these 5 values, which were success for all, which I mentioned already, golden rule, which I think most people know means treat people the way you'd want to be treated, childlike joy, which is kind of a fun one. It means bring the kid in you to work every day and really have that same like enthusiasm and like bliss that children have, unless they're throwing a temper tantrum. Some have young kids, so it's not always joyful, but mostly. And then what we call stay thirsty, which is basically about ambition from within, because thirst comes from within. It's not something people don't tell you, hey, you should be thirsty. Your thirst is a natural thing, and we have natural ambition. And then finally, Shoshin, which means beginner's mind. It's a term that's used a lot, beginner's mind. You probably heard it, but basically the idea that everything can be done better if approached like a beginner, where you can always learn, right? So we're always beginning learning. So those 5 values became really, really core to what we do and why we do what we do. And at literally every presentation, people talk about the values. We talk to our customers about the values. When we make decisions, we talk about the values. They're everywhere. And then we wrap all those up into what we call our purpose, which is sort of a summary of all that. And we talk about our purpose being to be living proof that you can win in business while being human first. So the idea of human first is there's not like our business life and our personal life, and at business we're going to be jerks, and at personal life we're going to be saints. Like we want to live at work like we want to live as human beings, and we are human beings. And the idea that business and personal are totally different things is in our view, a dated concept. So anyways, that whole concept of those 5 values and the purpose is the why behind what we do.
So I've got a few questions from people. There's a couple of things I just wanted to dig into first. I love the Dr. Doom story at the beginning of the book. And, you know, the fact that Salesforce was sleepwalking to their doom with an 8% monthly churn. And do you think there are still companies out there that are failing to wake up to the...
oh my God. I was talking to a company 2 days ago, and they're like, yeah, we're kind of living that intro to your book right now. And it was a decent sized company. It was literally the exact same thing. And yeah, totally. I mean, by the way, I think there's 2 kinds of companies. So if you're born in the cloud company, you know, many companies go through a phase where they're in this very high churn. You know, this company I was talking to was at a more than 50% a year churn, and it was so not quite as bad as Salesforce at that time, but it was very high. So this company was really trying to reconcile with how to change things, right? Then the other one, though, I think is almost equally interesting, is the company that is an older company that has a super high renewal rate and everything is sticky. And so therefore they think there's no problems at all. But meanwhile, the customers are super unhappy and planning to leave them. And I've seen those companies, things are fine until they just fall off a cliff, you know? So they're both kinds. There's the people that are born in the cloud that are dealing with this world of challenge, and you can definitely get through it. And they're the people that are maybe coming from older businesses where they think this isn't going to affect me, right? So both of those exist.
And the other thing was about, you talk about customer success as being an organizational wide strategy. This isn't a departmental practice. It's not a Gainsight thing.
Yeah.
You know, this is a company belief. What are kind of the key organizational changes you think are important to really living customer success?
Totally, yeah. So I'll give you kind of you can almost think of like a maturity curve, like so the stages to kind of getting there, right? So when you think of the organization, usually what people would describe their organization as before customer success, the word they'd use most commonly is react, right? So many companies, and it's fine, that's how you start. They'd feel like, look, we respond to support issues. We, when things are escalated, we deal with them, but we're not proactive and we're surprised. So that's kind of the existing state. So usually people organizationally go through a few kind of steps from that. So number one, they often create a customer success team, right? So that might be 5 people, might be 10 people, might be 3 people. And that team often has a charter, right? But what ends up happening is that team's charter can never be as big as their ability. It can never match their ability to execute when they have 3, 5, 7 people, right? So one of the problems is you can't hire enough CSMs to change everything in the company. So phase 1 is often a CSM team that maybe is focused on adoption, renewal, retention, et cetera. Phase 2, many companies are then integrating customer success with an integrated kind of, you can think of like a post-sales customer experience team, right? They might put that under a chief customer officer who has support, services, customer success, training, right? And that group has like the whole post-sale journey. Phase 3, often people are giving that group revenue responsibility. So one of the things that some companies do as they get more mature is they say, my sales team is responsible for anything new, and my customer success team does the renewals. So my sales team doesn't do the renewals at all, right? So they move those. So the sales team's all about growth. The next level is sometimes people are moving even expansion, maybe some kinds of expansion, like small upsell, into that customer success team. And then finally, I'd say the last phase is where the product team and the marketing team and the sales team, maybe being the 3 of the biggest other teams, have kind of rethought what they do with customer success in mind. So it's sort of like a virus, it's infected the rest of the company, right? So that's like the last phase. So we kind of think of this maturity curve from like a small CSM team to an integrated customer success organization with all the post sales to like reframing the whole company.
I was going to kick off with a question from Jalika, from Paddle, I think, isn't it, Jalika?
Hi, Jalika.
I might shortly maybe put everybody on panel on the grid view. We can put everybody to put their videos on, and they can put.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
If they want to ask a question. So it says, and forgive me, I'm going to read this. So one challenge I've seen in fast-growing companies is that each function has their own technology to manage workflows and process.
Yes.
The challenge is, how do you assure you only have one source of truth and you don't have to use multiple tools to get various data? Becomes tricky when you have HubSpot, Salesforce, Periscope, Zendesk, Customer, and several other technologies. How do you see Gainsight fit into this, particularly in conjunction with Salesforce? So,
totally.
Pretty big question.
Yeah, and I'd say there's 2 layers to that question. There's, okay, how do you standardize workflow in general across a company? And then how do you do it specifically for customer health and customer view? So when our most successful customers, their goal is to bring all of that into Gainsight and then standardize all the workflow through Gainsight. But then Gainsight connects to Zendesk and Salesforce and HubSpot and can drive workflow in those. So we become this integrated view of the customer and orchestration engine to drive those other systems. I don't know if a company will ever get to the point where there's one workflow system for everything in the company for all processes, right? Like that's because inherently the way product development thinks and the way customer success thinks are a little different. But I think having one workflow system for each business process is important. So as an example, we think of customer success not as a department, but as a business process that touches sales and marketing, and having customer success be an integrated process is really important. Gainsight does that. Now, the way we try to do that is by not requiring every other department to live in Gainsight. So Gainsight basically can show up in Salesforce in a very tightly integrated way and show up in Zendesk. And so basically it shows up in Slack if you use Slack. So basically it shows up where people work. So our core users in CSM might use Gainsight every day. Everyone else is using Gainsight as part of the other things they do. And I think that's the model for any workflow software company is you can have some core users that kind of live in what you do, but if you want to really be enterprise wide, you need to live where they live, right? Which are going to be other tools.
So Jalika, maybe if you want to follow up to that, then just drop it on the chat. And so if people, if you scroll down to the bottom of the video, you should see the chat button there, and you can submit some questions if you hover over the bottom of the screen. So this was another one from Jalika. So customers are frequently asked how their experience was and how this could be improved. Being asked this several times in different ways by different service providers can become pretty tiring, resulting in a lower response rate. How do you believe it is best achieved to increase the NPS response rate, and what would you consider a good response rate?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and I do think even as a consumer, if you call in for a service and they say press 1 to participate in a survey afterwards, I'm like, God bless the people that participate in those surveys. I never do. I just want to get off the phone with my telco provider or whatever, right? So I think the survey fatigue, which is what people call it, is a big issue. There's things you can do. Number one, I think with our clients, one of the things they do is our technology lets you send the survey from the person they deal with. So that's a very tactical but important thing, right? If it's an email survey and it comes from Steven or it comes from somebody that's very different than marketing at gainsight.com or whatever, which is where a lot of surveys come from. So that's like a very simple response rate hack. A second one I think is closing the loop. So I think a lot of people, as you just alluded to, feel like, hey, I'd love to hear your feedback, but then it's just kind of crickets of what is going to happen based on that. So I believe if you want to get your customers, especially if you have B2B customers, into kind of a higher feedback loop, you need to do things based on that feedback. So they call that closing the loop. And what that means is you get the feedback, you review it as a team, you come back to the customer, you do a call to tell them what's going to happen based on it. The next time somebody meets them, they acknowledge that feedback. So the customer doesn't feel like that feedback is lost, is the second best practice. There's a closed loop process. Number 3, people are starting to think about ways to do that, obviously multiple channels, right? Some of you probably already do this today where you do it in your application. Now, I'd say if you do it in your application, you're sometimes getting different people than if you do it, for example, via email. If you do it via email, you might be getting that executive who may not be in your application, right? But if you do it in the application, you might get that user or admin. And then the last one people are thinking about and doing is trying to tie the survey to not just be some kind of regular annual thing, which is fine, but customers kind of know this is just like a marketing thing to to pay out your bonus plan, right? Like that's kind of what a lot of surveys are, is like there's a bonus plan based on it or whatever. Instead, doing it topically based on things that just happen. So a lot of people will do it after a support case, but some people start doing it after EBRs, executive business reviews, or things like that, kind of timing it to events that have just happened. And so basically like kind of making it more contextual for the customer of, you're providing feedback to me that's relevant to what just happened in my business.
For me, the most important thing in this is actually when you ask somebody's opinion, you use the information, and you can tell people what you're doing and why. Because that just really hacks us off, doesn't it? Someone asks me and then they don't do anything with the data.
Oh yeah, and one example of that I'd share one example of that, by the way, which is like we do a survey for a conference, right? And you probably go to conferences, you get surveys, and you're like, will they ever do anything about this? So actually, I read. We have a big conference, 5,000 people. I read all the responses, 800 responses myself, and I wrote a very detailed blog post about what we're going to do based on this feedback. And so I think then the next time we send that survey, to Steven's point, people are going to be like, okay, this company actually cares about my feedback. They're listening to me. I'll add one bonus one. We don't actually do this yet, but I think some of our customers do. I think it's actually very creative. Some people will pay a bonus based on a CSM or account manager's NPS or, survey feedback, meaning you get more of a bonus if you get higher feedback. I've seen many companies now start to say, I don't care what your score is that you get as an account manager. I'm going to pay you based on the percentage of customers that respond, right? So in other words, I want to hear all the feedback. I think it really makes sense because if you're a CSM or you're your account manager, you're anyone, you don't always control that whole experience, right? So if they give you a 1 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, you get celebrated for the 10 out of 10. You might get castigated for the 1 out of 10. The reality is you don't control that whole thing. So instead, what you can control is getting the customer to believe that you're going to listen to the feedback. So I've seen some customers, actually one of our clients, they get like a 90% response rate on NPS. And for comparison, average is probably 10 to 15%. A lot of our clients, because of some things that they do, get to 20, 25%. But basically this company's getting 90% because the CSMs are paid for the response, not for the actual number.
So one of the other questions I was asked to pitch to you beforehand was around, and you talked about bonus, is compensation.
Yeah.
So, customer success in teams are quite different individuals from the sales team. And actually, you need the two to work together.
Totally.
How do you use compensation as a way to drive the right kind of behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of the big things that kind of is tied into compensation is what does the CS person own, right? So in ownership, you can think of a CS role where they're about influence versus owning the actual business outcome. So on the influence side, they own adoption, NPS, leading indicators, basically, right? And the outcome side, they own the actual renewal or the expansion, like they have a quota, right? So that's like decision one is, am I going to give the CSM commercial responsibility or not? So some people do, some people don't. Generally speaking, in higher volume, lower ASP businesses where you're selling kind of a little bit more transactionally, people tend to over time give the CSM the actual revenue responsibility. In higher touch, higher ASP businesses, the CSM is typically on more of an MBO based on these leading indicators. And so now on what the MBO, if they're in the MBO side, what are they going to MBO on, right? And so there, what I would think about is the cycle time for your business. So if you're in a business that's like month to month, even if the CSM doesn't have a quota, you could compensate them on gross renewal rate or net renewal rate for their business. You could do that because if it's month to month, I do work now and it can impact things, near term. But by contrast, imagine your customer is a 3 or 5 year contract. Compensating your CSM on the renewal rate or whatever is ridiculous, right? It doesn't make any sense because the work you do now affects things years from now. And so what I find there is people usually will come up with these leading indicators. Often it's a combination of their customer health score, if that's some kind of aggregate of what they're doing, which might include adoption or NPS or other factors. I've seen some people do it based on the score itself, like, how much did you move that score? And I've seen some people do it. Actually, one of our clients did a very creative thing where they kind of gamified it, if people know that term. They basically defined activities. My customer spoke at a conference. My customer did an EBR, et cetera. And you get points for each activity, and the CSMs get compensation based on the points. I thought that was very creative, especially if you have an early career team, because that's the other variable, right? If you have an early career team, I think they'll respond better to very tangible micro incentives. If you have a team that's a lot more experienced, they may want to kind of control the bigger picture, and they don't love the idea of being managed at that sort of points level, right? So the factors are, do they own renewals or not? Is it a long contract business or a short contract business? And then is your team kind of an early career team that maybe responds to very tight incentives, or maybe a more experienced team where you want to compensate them on something more general?
Yeah. The big topic. I'm going to go to Chris. I'm going to try and unmute you. Yeah, there you are. Hey, Chris. So I know you had a couple of questions.
Yeah, hi, Nick. How are you doing? Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too.
So first question is actually related to Vonage. We've just been acquired. If you heard. So one thing we're thinking about is, we're going to have two sets of products. We're going to have the UC product from Vonage side, the CSAS, the call center product from New Voice Media. But And we'll have customer success managers for both sides, and probably there's another party to it. There's the Nexmo, another company involved in who Vonage acquired a while back, and they'll have some customer success managers. But my theory is that you only really want one customer success manager per customer, really, who would know enough about all the products. Really, I think that would be and then to tier it depending on size of customer or vertical. I'm just presuming that's the best way to go. I can't see any other way to go on that.
Your question was, is that the right way to go from my perspective?
Yeah.
I think that is a great question. So maybe generalizing it for everyone else. When do you specialize CSM by product versus having one CSM?
Absolutely.
So I think it's all about scope, right? So if some companies, the scope is so big and the stakeholders are so different in the customer that there's no way a CSM can manage all of that. So let me pick a extreme example. You can imagine Microsoft, when they sell Azure to the developers versus Office 365 to IT, versus the Surface tablet laptops, right? They can't have one CSM across all that. So they have specialists by kind of area. I think it's all about the stakeholder. So in the world of Vonage, I think there's a lot of alignment between, it's probably not the exact same stakeholder, but there's probably a lot of alignment between the stakeholder buying contact center software and the stakeholder with the UCaaS kind of decision-making. And I know there's a lot of integration. So to me, that makes sense having one CSM there. But in contrast, if Vonage also had a business that was doing security software or something, right, with a totally different buyer, that's where I'd say, you know what, you probably need a separate CSM.
Yeah, got it. Thanks. And one more quick question while I've got the floor then. So I remember early on reading some white paper. I think you had 10 laws. Gainsight produced some really, really good white paper. If anyone hasn't read it, I can't recommend that one enough. And one of the things that we're getting to now in there is about measuring time to value. Yeah. And you can do it by saying to a customer, "Oh, are you getting value now? Tick in the box, thank you." And I just don't think that's enough. I just don't think it's enough. Have you got any advice on the concrete measures? Because obviously we're thinking about if they reach 60-70% of usage, if they've given us an NPS, if they've paid their money, if they, there are probably 5 or 6 concrete things. Is there any sort of gems that you can share there?
Yeah, totally. I think there's like some data-driven stuff and some qualitative stuff. So on the data-driven side, I think one thing that a lot of companies do over time is come up with a consistent definition of value between the onboarding team and the customer success team. And then in the onboarding, you have a gate, which is if you haven't crossed that value threshold, it's not really out of onboarding, right? So it's still, right? And so we, at Gainsight, for our own business, we define this, kind of metric. It's essentially like it's an adoption score based on, how much of the product they're using and how often they're using it. And that score is the same one that they measure in onboarding and customer success. And we have that as a quantitative gate, and you have to get to a certain threshold. Each business is going to be different what that threshold is, but we have agreed on what green means in both teams. So that's like a very good exercise to do, which we've done and took a lot of time to get agreement on that. So it's like one thing. But I think the second thing is if you have larger customers, I do think that there's an element of, did you get through some kind of a executive steer co or executive business review meeting that maybe at the end of onboarding, and I think a lot of companies, if you really do it right, which by the way, it's never happens this way because it's so few things happen exactly as planned. But if you do it right, you have in the beginning you have some kind of a kickoff in the project with the steering committee, and at the end kind of a sign off. And you've validated the business outcomes are there. One of the dangers, I think the danger is that in onboarding, often you're kind of delegated at the client with the more junior person, right? Yeah. Probably a great person, but probably not the person that knows the strategic objectives. So you get out of onboarding, that junior person tells your CSM or onboarding person, things are great. We've achieved our outcomes. Meanwhile, the senior executive is saying, "What I bought this product for all these things, and it's not achieving those." Right? There's a huge problem. Everyone has it. We've dealt with it too. And so I think that's like getting that like confirmation from an executive through some kind of steering committee. If you have big customers, I think that's something to think about.
Yeah, great. No, good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. I have one question here from Laura from SmartUp. So I think there's a stage-specific aspect to this. That pretty early stage business, but moving very fast. If you have any views on the optimal structure at that kind of, first, 30, 40, 50 employees, and the split between sales and customer success, or the classic, as Laura puts it, hunter-farmer split?
Totally. Yeah. I think in the early days, how's it going? You can't specialize too much. You just don't have enough people. Right. And I think that there's some level of teamwork that has to happen. So I found in the very early stage startups, 30, 40, 50 people, it's unlikely that you're going to have the CSM doing all the commercials. I've found kind of in the early days, you have salespeople and you have CSMs. You haven't yet specialized hunter farmer. It's probably, you don't have enough customers to renew and things like that, right? So you have a salesperson, you have CSM. The CSM usually is doing onboarding and adoption, and the salesperson's doing everything commercial, and they kind of work in a tandem. Ideally, you could almost pair them up, or have some ratio, right? And they can work really closely together, and kind of people call them a pod. And then over time, that CSM might take over the renewal, or you might split hunter farmer and sales. But I would say at that 30-40, sales and CSM don't overcomplicate it, would be my advice.
Yeah. Sam, I think Sam's from Virtual Stock, and maybe you're there waving at us somewhere, Sam. Question was, do you have any tips for working with an inherited team of people who are used to a more reactive support approach rather than a more commercial, proactive approach to customer success?
Totally, yeah. No, I think that's actually, I do a lot of talks where I come to a company and I'm speaking to the support team or trying to help them understand, kind of this new world. So I think there's a few things when I talk to people that I would do. So number one is helping them understand, and maybe it's a training of what are the outcomes your customers are actually trying to get. I've actually found, honestly, in customer support, oftentimes you only know about the problems. So you don't really know like, why do people buy our software, right? I know it sounds basic. I don't mean the marketing bullet points on the website. That's like too high level, right? But what are the actual business outcomes that people are getting from the software? So they start understanding, what are customers trying to get towards, right? I think a lot of support people never got that training. Salespeople get that training, CS training. So number one would be training them on your actual business outcomes. Number two is appealing to the human need for ambition. Talk to them about this customer success profession. Stephen knows it's, in the US, it's like the third fastest growing job on LinkedIn. I think in almost every country, it's one of the top jobs out there. So, kind of talk to them about this profession, how much it's growing. Obviously, you'll get them to learn and read and stuff like that, but get them excited about the personal ambition. Because I think one of the things that happens is if you're a support person or you're more reactive, customer success is your ticket to moving up much faster. Versus in the old world, if you're a support person, you're more reactive, that career was fine, but you wouldn't really be able to go to the top through that. And so I talk about that kind of ambition. And then the third thing is, I think there's some skills that people can learn from salespeople. And over time, a lot of customer success teams are actually taking sales training. It might be surprising to some of you, but they're taking training on the sort of methodologies that salespeople use. Some of you might have heard of challenger selling. There's a lot of these methodologies. They're all quite similar. They're all about not just doing what the client tells you to do, but really driving the process. And so I actually think there's a lot of training that you can do on helping these people learn how to be proactive. Because it's not a natural skill. A lot of people like being reactive. It's fun to help people, fun to put out fires. It's a little scary sometimes to be proactive, right? So that's the third thing.
Yeah. And then Harriet, remind me which company you're from. I think it's either Triptease or Jubilant. Which one of those? Yeah, I was right. Thank you. I got one out of two. We're currently looking at headcount for next year. How many CSMs do we need? Do you have any advice on a good ratio split? Well, obviously, part of that, I suppose, is tied to how many customers you've got. Are you high touch, low touch, tech touch? I'll
give you like the quick version of the calculus on that. It is a complex thing, but there's kind of, you can think of like you've got multiple constraints, right? So the constraints are essentially as follows. On one side, you've got how much can one human being manage, right? So it's one CSM or whatever. On the other side, how much can your business afford, right? So if you went all the way to one side, you'd say, well, every customer has a CSM. And if you went to the other side, you'd say one CSM manages all customers, right? Neither of those really make sense. And so what I found is there's sort of two sets of ratios that end up constraining things. So on one side, honestly, if you're trying to do a high touch approach to CS, meaning your customer, their business challenges, you have a regular communication with them on a quarterly basis, it's very hard to do a true high touch for I'd say more than like 15 to 20 customers, and different people on the phone might have different views of that, but it's very hard to like even remember more than 15 to 20 customer names, right? And I think if you're a high touch named account manager and you can't remember all the names of your accounts, you've got a problem, right? So there's this sort of like basic constraint of how much you could do in that high touch executive business review, meeting the customers, et cetera, right? Then you've got this next level, which is what people call kind of the mid touch, right? And that's where, you can probably manage 50, 100 accounts through some kind of like trigger system. Obviously things like Gainsight help there. And there you have to just not kid yourself. You're not going to know everything about those customers, right? You're not going to be deep on their business. But you're at least going to be able to jump in on early warning issues and help them. By the way, those kind of people, maybe they're more product knowledgeable. They probably have a different skill set. And then you got the kind of, okay, I need to manage 500 customers, which there's no way you can do it through human beings. So it's got to be really almost fully digital, right? So you get these kind of ratios. And then on the other side, it's how much can your company afford? And I think in the early days, most companies are saying, look, I really want to invest in CS because it's going to drive adoption, it's going to drive advocacy, it's going to drive retention. And so they're not loading the CS team with too much. Some people measure this by how much does a CSM manage. I've seen some companies where the CSM in the early days is literally managing, $500,000 of ACV or annual contract spend, right? Over time, as you get to scale, you want that to be 2 million, 3 million, et cetera. But a lot of companies in the early days are not loading their CS team with too much. But if you went all the way to say my CS team has like $100,000 per CSM, that wouldn't make any sense. So you kind of got some constraints. They're probably around $500,000 per person if you did an average of ARR divided by people, something like that. So those are the constraints. There's the ratio of accounts on one side, and there's sort of the dollars managed on the other.
Yeah, thank you. Question from Emma. And Emma says, any tips for managing exec level stakeholders? I'm presuming in the customers who are consistently happy but not engaged.
Totally. Oh my God, it's such a huge issue, right? So one of the biggest challenges is like, I think an executive, they get involved in the sales process. Salesperson's usually good at getting them pulled in, right? And then they buy something, and they generally just want it to work. I think some of us on the phone are executives, and honestly, you don't want to have to deal with the vendor afterwards. You just like it to work. Like, there's not really a reason why we should have to get involved if you're a client. So I think it's actually a fundamental challenge. It's not something that you're just doing wrong, but there's some tips I've seen that work really well. Okay, number one is speaking their language. So one of the biggest mistakes I think everyone makes, and we've made this too, I think everyone makes these, is you somehow get the executive into like an executive business review or something, right? And then you open up and you're like, okay, let's review the features of the last release, and let's talk about the features that you're using, and let's show a graph of adoption. And the executive's like, why am I in this meeting? Literally, like that's what they're thinking. And by the way, they're not going to come to the next one. So the first thing you can do is really make the content of the engagements that you get more appealing, right? And I think executives often are they're a very small set of things that they want to know. What can we do better? Right? Well, first they want to talk. They want to share what their goals are. So I think giving them the floor to share is important, right? They want to know what they can do better, what their team can do better. Like, what are they not doing that they should be doing? They want to know how their competition is doing with this tool or this area versus them. They're competitive, right? And they want to know how this fits into their strategic goals, right? So one thing that I think people miss out on is, okay, Miss Executive, Mr. Executive, what are your 5 priorities for the year, right? And then how do we speak in their language? And that's where you're documenting kind of a success plan and what are their objectives and all that. So number one is speak their language. That's just a huge, huge thing. Number 2 is then when you try to get them to meetings, in the email, speak their language, right? So in the email, why should I take this meeting? Don't just say, I'd love to schedule an executive business review with you. And it's like, well, I don't know. The executive probably has 1,000 meetings to go to. Why this one? So I'd love to schedule an executive business review with you to cover these 3 points. Number 1, where we think your team could get more value from the product. Number 2, how some competitors are using this and what you can learn. Number 3, how we think this aligns to your strategic initiative X, like this initiative you mentioned. So why should I come to the meeting? Tip number 3, consider a tiered meeting. We started doing this in some of our accounts. No executive wants to go to a 2-hour executive business review. That's another crazy thing. Hey, I'd love to invite you to my executive business review for 2 hours, right? Nobody's going to do that. So I'd love to invite you to my executive business review for the first 30 minutes, and then we're going to work with the teams for the next 90 minutes, right? So you join for the first, so you make the first 30 truly executive level, and the next 90, they're about features and functions or whatever. And then finally, one thing companies can do a lot better is the exec-to-exec stakeholder management. So, you probably, if you have larger customers, you probably have your execs are kind of talking to their execs. At Gainsight, we've operationalized our cadence, and actually we use a product for this, where each customer has sort of an executive sponsor on the Gainsight side. And we actually have an automated process where they get notified with a sample email to send to that exec sponsor to kind of check in on a regular basis. And we track whether those happened or not. So we have a whole rigorous process for this sort of exec to exec touch, which I think is a really, really good tactic to consider.
Yeah, I was just looking. Emma's with locals. And they are selling to some of the biggest customers on the planet. And so I think that was really useful. And hopefully that answered your question. I'm just going to scroll back up. Suddenly I've had a whole flurry. So there was a Futurely one. I can't see. Mark from Futurely. What for you are the key elements to consider when building your health check scoring model?
Absolutely, yeah. So for health scoring, and we've written a lot about this, you can certainly find. Actually, I wrote a blog on. It's called the CEO's Guide to Measuring Your Customers, where I have a very detailed version of this. But the high level is, health score. People often want to come up with one health score, right? And I say health scores plural, not health score singular. And what I mean by that is that for a given customer, there's a lot of different parts of the experience, and knowing whether they're red, yellow, green, it's useful. But actually what's really useful is knowing the part of the experience that's red, yellow, green, and what you can do about it, right? And so the first thing we recommend is breaking it into pieces. I'll describe what those recommendations are in a second. The second thing we do is recommend, if it's a larger customer, you might have multiple engagements with that client, different deployments, different business units using you. So you may want to have scores for those as well. So how do you break up that score? What are the pieces? We think about two core ingredients to the score. We say customer success equals customer outcomes plus customer experiences. So outcome is how much are they using and getting value from your product, and experience is how do they feel about you. So for the outcome score, we have, if you don't have something in mind, we have a standard framework. We call it DEAR, DEAR. It's designed for kind of a software SaaS company, so you can tweak it for other businesses. But DEAR stands for deployment, engagement, adoption, and ROI. And so what we've built is a framework for saying, okay, how should you think about deployment? Is it deployed? What percentage of the licenses are deployed if it's a license-based model? Engagement, when was the last time you had touch with the executive sponsor, things like that. Adoption, obviously, how often are they using the product? How deeply are they using it? ROI, have you confirmed ROI with the customer? We have a recommended process. So that all kind of flows into the outcome score. And then for the experience score, we'll often bring in their NPS, their support experience, and then also a subjective read, if it's a larger account, by the account manager or CSM of how they're feeling. So you end up with these two sets of scores, the outcome score and the experience score. And then you can think about a customer that has great outcomes and experiences, they could be a really good reference. They might be ready to expand, right? A customer that has good outcomes but not great experiences, that probably needs some executive love, right? A customer that has great experiences but not very good outcomes, that probably needs maybe a PS engagement to really reconfigure or whatever. So you can kind of then decide what to do based on that.
Mark's obviously been reading up on you because he also asked what your prediction is for the next Steelers versus Browns game.
Oh my gosh, do I have an NFL football fan here? That's great. I love it. We actually, it's coming up. I would say that I'm very impressed that if people don't know, the Steelers, the team I grew up following in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Browns are a very lovable, longtime team, but has had a tough road the last few years, but have gotten really good. So I'm excited that there's a rivalry again.
So Matt from Mu Systems, this is a hotel management system based out of Czech, growing super fast. We have a really heavy 3-week implementation process, including 3 to 5 days on site. We're debating whether implementations should be part of the customer success team or whether they should be separate. What would you recommend?
Yeah, great question. So I think if you have a longer implementation cycle, and my business does too, by the way. So ours is like, anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, roughly, sometimes longer. And so we have a onboarding team. It's really a professional services team. And so I think if you have kind of a real onboarding process that's kind of complex and involves different technical and business work, separating those out is important. You can't do it in the very early days because early on you don't have enough people. But once you get to 100 people, 200 people in the company, I think you can separate them out. Have a leader for both. I think the leader for both should report into the same kind of Uber leader. So you might have a chief customer officer underneath that person, a head of customer success, head of onboarding or professional services. But I think the best practice is definitely to split them out in a higher touch business.
Okay. I was going to try and see. I was just going to ask everybody who's in front of their laptop, which I imagine is most of us, to go on to video. I haven't tried this, and I thought it might be interesting if anybody does want to ask a question, they can just put their hand up, and I'm going to see how many. I'm going to full screen. How many I can get on one screen? So there's Matt down there. Matt, any follow-up questions to Nick on that? What do you currently do?
Yeah, so currently that implementations team sits in the operations arm, whereas we call it account management, that sits with our sales arm. Yeah. So we feel that this disconnects a little bit, and we're just debating it over and over where to stick it.
It's a common thing, Matt, is often CS starts as account management and sales, but many people pull that out and pull the services team out and put it into one customer group. So that you may not be ready for that now, but clearly, like getting that alignment to be tighter is really important.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to go on to the next screen. See who else I've got. Maybe I'll pull some people out. Sachin, anything from you for Nick? Sachin is the CEO. I'm really putting you on the spot here. Sachin is the CEO of Kizenhard, which is an agri-tech company based out of Cambridge. Great. Hey, Sachin.
Yeah. Hey, Nick. Great to hear you. Actually, we are an agri-tech company, and our customer success has been really heavy. It's like boots on the ground type.
Oh yeah.
To onboard farmers and the enterprise staff. And typically, a usual debate at our side is really like how much time we spend at lower level, like tier 4s, where really we don't sell into them, but their engagement and involvement is really, really important. So yeah, it will be good to hear your thoughts on that.
And I'm assuming you sell to those tier 4s through kind of distributors?
Yeah, we don't sell into them. They are our end users. We connect to them through our middle tiers, like tier 2s and 3s, who are the enterprises.
I see. Got it. Yeah. One thing I've seen, if somebody has kind of it sounds like you have like a network-based business.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
Great, by the way. And I'm assuming you can't, in your business, you can't use the hunter-farmer terminology because that would get confusing.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? When you said farmer in between, I was like, okay.
So what I think what I've seen some people do in that world where you have customer success for different kinds of stakeholders. Like I see this actually in healthcare too, right? If you sell in healthcare, sometimes you have the providers as a customer, meaning the hospitals. Sometimes you have the doctors. You have the payers, which are the insurance providers, and you have the consumers, the human beings like all of us. And so often what I see when people have a network-based model is they will create multiple. So maybe a different kind of team for that tier 4 that has a different profile, more of like almost like an end user oriented team versus the tier 1 where they're more commercial, account management, et cetera. So I definitely see people kind of segmenting those out.
I'm going to pick on one more. Anthony, you in Dublin?
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
With Glowfox. Hey, so yeah. Glowfox is a full stack platform for class-based gyms. So Pilates studios, spin studios, box studios, all the kind of places you're in every day, I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
Really interesting, maybe to put you on the spot, Anthony, is this is a high volume. So we've been talking to locals, they've got like 12 customers. If they get 100 customers, they've won the market.
Yeah.
Locals has got 1,000 already. They may have 10,000 customers. This is a very different proposition. Maybe, Anthony, if you could articulate some of the kind of key challenges you've got at Glowfox.
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly trying to, rip up the customer success playbook and try and figure out what exactly is the best way to go for us. And we're trying to get to that sweet spot of like how many accounts per CSM and what actually works. Some of the questions I had were kind of covered earlier, but I think for us at the moment that we're struggling with and we're trying to get to is who should own the the upsells. Because in our organization, sales, they make the sale and then they very much pass it to the CSMs who own the customer. So it doesn't make sense for us to move it back to sales when, our guys are talking to them all the time. So I'd love to just get some thoughts on that, on what you think is the best way to approach that.
Yeah, no, and we work with a lot of high volume companies. That's probably where we actually have the most business because that's where technology is important and all that. So one of our big clients actually is MindBody Online, which is, I don't know if you know them, but they're big.
I think they know them quite well.
They're our biggest competitor. We're coming for them hard.
So forget I said that. But that whole area, just watching kind of how some of these companies do it, they often are putting expansion in the customer success team because it is super inefficient to like bring a salesperson back in to add $100 a month upgrade or whatever, right? So that is very, very common. One of the other things I found actually in that industry is sometimes they're hiring the people from that background, the people that have worked in gyms, right? That's kind of an interesting thing of like, if your CS person kind of comes from that, they can connect with the customer a little bit better, get that rapport, open up and all that. Obviously they're doing a lot of tiering. One thing I think a lot of companies are doing now is in the high volume is actually doing some really interesting, what people call firmographic analysis of their customers. So what they're doing is they're saying, if I'm selling to small business, it doesn't matter how great my offering is. Often my success is tied to the success of their business, right? So it's actually not about how well they use my product, et cetera, but it's about, one of the things I've seen many companies do now is building a really great data set of who are our customers and what are the customers are most likely to be successful look like, not successful with our product, but successful as a company, right? They're buying data about foot traffic and location and they're basically using that to essentially build a model that says these are the high likelihood to succeed customers. And then they're putting more of their CS energy into those, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, we've started doing something similar ourselves because we've got a pretty good idea now from our own experience, which one of these guys are likely to go the distance and be around in 4 or 5 years' time. And you can pretty much tell that from an initial conversation with them, and obviously we're trying to help them, and educate them as well and bring them along their own journey. One thing I thought was interesting when you said about the sales training, for CS teams, and I think that's probably one reservation that some of our guys have in terms of talking to people in a sales capacity. But how do you balance that without, becoming too salesy, because you don't want to destroy the really good relationship that the guys have built up, as account managers?
A great question. I think one of the things I'd encourage, and by the way, maybe this is one of the final comments, got to go in a couple minutes, but one of the final things I'd encourage people to consider is there is bad sales and there's good sales, right? So a lot of people would say, I don't want to become too salesy, right? And really that's formed based on experience of bad salespeople, right? People that are pushy and don't listen to you. But actually, I think great salespeople have skills that CS people should learn, and they won't feel bad. Like as an example, challenging the customer to make sure they do what they need, not just what they ask for, and things like that, right? And so I think sales training that's out there that's oriented around being a great salesperson, it's great for CS people. It won't feel bad at all. It'll feel like I'm helping that client. Because frankly, sometimes what happens as a CS person is you're sitting there and you want to help them, but they're not doing the right things. And if you just doing what they want, they'll never get what they need, right? It's like the Rolling song. So I think that there's an element of getting customers to what they need, and that is what great sales is all about.
Do you have any ones that you recommend that you thought were good that you've come across?
We internally just did something. It's a book called Proactive Selling. We have no relationship with this company, but we read the book. I read it too, and then we kind of trained our team on it. We had this guy who wrote the book and do the training. If you need the info, I can introduce you. But it's so good because it resonated so much with CS people about how you get stuck at the lower levels, how do you move up, how do you connect to the executive, how do you connect to business value, all that kind of stuff. So, Stephen, I'll probably have to call it in a minute here, but this has been an amazing discussion, so thank you.
I will follow that. I had one last question, and this was from Bahar, and it was, what's the profile of the ideal customer success person?
I think it's a great question. You probably know that there's multiple kind of profiles, so I'll kind of break it into a few. So I think they're in an early stage startup. What you really want is somebody that's just, people say hungry, willing to learn, fast learner, good communicator. It's pretty much a general athlete, right? But then it kind of splits into a few profiles. One is the technical expert who, maybe it's an enterprise product and there's some complexity and they really need to be able to get deep on the product. The second one is the person coming from the domain, meaning they walked in the shoes of the client, right? Like I talked about, somebody who run a gym before in the example we just talked about. The third one is the management consultant, somebody who is good with work with big companies where they can drive change management, process, strategy, things like that. And then the fourth is somebody with a little bit more of a commercial orientation, coming out of account management. Those are the four that I think you want some mix of those, but you need to kind of pick which one fits for you.
Nick, you're an absolute star. It's always such a pleasure. And, I know not everybody's, most people are on mute, but maybe just take it from me. Thank you very much. That was a really, really
have a wonderful rest of the week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.